Students, today we discuss locomotion and reproduction. In the EAMCET examination, the weightage of locomotion and reproduction is generally 1 or 2 marks. First of all, we have to discuss the locomotion, then we have to discuss the reproduction. Finally, we have to discuss what are the other important bits regarding the locomotion and the reproduction. Now regarding the locomotion, initially I am giving some hints regarding the process of the locomotion. What is meant by locomotion? The movement of an organism from one place to another place, that we call it as locomotion. The process of locomotion and the reproduction will be discussed with reference to Protozoa. Now, as we observe the Protozoa, the taxonomic position of Protozoa is phylum. The phylum Protozoa come under the kingdom Protista. In the phylum Protozoa, all are unicellular. The body is made by one cell, and all these unicellular organisms are microscopic. So, the unicellular organisms are also called animalcules. Now, as we observe the locomotion in Protozoa, the locomotion is brought by, one we call it as Pseudoporeal, second one we call it as cilia, third one we call it as flagella, and the last one we call it as myonemes. As we observe these locomotory organelles, the first one we call it as Pseudoporeal. As we observe the Pseudoporeal, these are purely temporary, just they appear and disappear. What are the permanent locomotory organelles? One we call it as cilia, the second one we call it as flagella, and the last one we call it as myonemes. As we observe the cilia, flagella, these locomotory organelles are arise or derived from the basal granule. Myonemes do not arise from the basal granule. Now regarding the locomotion, we have to discuss some bits. While discussing the bits around each and every question, we have to discuss some important points. Now you have to observe the first question regarding the locomotion in Protozoa. Now as we observe the first question, you have to observe the first question. Temporary outgrowths of cell which are formed on the surface of the body of the movement of cytoplasm. Now as we observe the unicellular organisms, the body is made by one cell. Inside the cell, what is present? The cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is classified into ectoplasm and endoplasm. Now the cytoplasm will undergo contraction and relaxations. Because of the movement of cytoplasm, the pseudopodia are going to appear. The pseudopodia are purely temporary. Whenever the cytoplasm undergoes contraction, we have to observe the formation of pseudopodia. Whenever the cytoplasm relax, the pseudopodia disappear. Now you have to observe the first question. Temporary outgrowths of cell which are formed on the surface of the body of the movement of cytoplasm. One we call it as pseudopodia. The second one we call it as cilia. The third one we call it as flagella. The fourth one we call it as myonemes. Out of these four options, the last three are permanent organelles. Now regarding this question, what are the temporary outgrowths? That we call it as pseudopodia. Now we move for the next question. What is the second question? Which of the following is a monopodial form? Which of the following is a monopodial form? Now as we observe the pseudopodia, in some examples many pseudopodia are present. If many pseudopodia are present, that we call it as polypodial condition. In some examples only one pseudopodium is present, that we call it as monopodial. Here what is the best example for the monopodial? Entamoeba histolytica. As we observe the Entamoeba histolytica, that is a parasitic form. Now you have to observe the question and options. Which of the following is a monopodial form? Monopodial means only one pseudopodium is present. Now as we observe amoeba, in the body of amoeba many pseudopodia present. Now what about the second option, entamoeba? In its body only one pseudopodium is present. The third one we call it as mastigamoeba. In the mastigamoeba both pseudopodium and flagellum present. But the fourth option is unrelated. Now what is the correct answer for this question is Entamoeba histolytica. Now we move for the next question. Pseudopodia formed from only ectoplasm. Now as we observe the pseudopodia are formed by the contraction and relaxation of cytoplasm. As we observe the cytoplasm, the outer part of cytoplasm we call it as ectoplasm, inner part we call it as endoplasm. As we observe the formation of pseudopodia, in some varieties the ecto-endoplasm participate in the formation of pseudopodia. But in some varieties only ectoplasm participate in the formation of pseudopodia. Now once again you have to observe the question. Pseudopodia formed from only ectoplasm. One we call it as reticulopodia. For the formation of reticulopodia both ecto-endoplasm participate. The second one we call it as philopodia. In the philopodia formation only the ectoplasm participates. Now the third one we call it as actinopodia. For the formation of actinopodia both ecto-endoplasm are required. Now the last one we call it as exopodia. Actinopodia is also called exopodia, or in the class actinopodia what are the pseudopodia? Exopodia. So third and fourth are one and the same. Now what is the correct answer for this question is philopodia. In the philopodia only the ectoplasm participates. Now we go for the next question. Filamentas branched and profusely interconnected to form a network like pseudopodia. Now here the student get a small doubt. As we observe the pseudopodia, one we call it as lobopodia, the second one we call it as philopodia, third one we call it as reticulopodia, and the last one we call it as exopodia. As we observe the philopodia, in the philopodia occasionally the pseudopodia are branched. But here what is the question? The pseudopodia here regarding this question, Filamentas branched and profusely interconnected in the form of a network like. As we observe the reticulopodia, in the reticulopodia all pseudopodia are united in the form of a net. So here what is the correct answer for this question? One we call it as actinopodia or exopodia. The second one we call it as myxopodia. It is also called reticulopodia. Why we call it as myxopodia? Here the pseudopodia are mixed. Why it is called reticulopodia? The pseudopodia are united in the form of a net, so called reticulopodia. The third one we call it as lobopodia. The fourth one we call it as philopodia. Regarding this question, network like pseudopodia, the correct answer is the myxopodia. Now we go for the next question. Exopodia occurs in. Now as we observe the pseudopodia, the first one we call it as lobopodia, and the second one we call it as philopodia, third one we call it as reticulopodia, and the fourth one we call it as exopodia. As we observe the exopodia, in the exopodia the pseudopodia are arranged in the radiating manner. In the pseudopodia, in the center axial filament or axoneme is present. Now in this type of pseudopodia, what type of cytoplasm is present? The sticky granular cytoplasm. Now you have to observe the question. Exopodia occurs in. As we observe the exopodia, they are arranged in a radiating manner. The exopodia are present in the heliojovans and radiolarians. What are the examples for the heliojovans? Actinophrys and actinospirium. They are also called the sun animalcules. What is the example for the radiolarians? That we call it as collojovam. So here in the heliojovans and radiolarians, what type of pseudopodia is present? Actinopodia or exopodia. How these pseudopodia, they are arranged radially. In each pseudopodium, what is present? The axoneme or axial filament. What type of cytoplasm is present? The granular sticky cytoplasm. Now what is the correct answer for this question is? Both 1 and 2 options are correct. Now we go for the next question. Which type of pseudopodium contains a central axial rod surrounded by granular and adhesive cytoplasm? Now as we observe the previous question, as we observe the exopodia or actinopodia, here the pseudopodia are arranged in the radiating manner. In the pseudopodia, axial filament or axoneme present. What type of cytoplasm is present? A granular sticky cytoplasm. Now based on this information you have to guess the answer. The first one is Exopodia, second one Filopodia, the third one is Rhidopodia, and the fourth one is Lobopodia. Now based on this information, what is the correct answer for this question? That we call it as Exopodia. Now we move for the next question. Now widely accepted theory for the pseudopodial formation. Now as we observe the movements of locomotion, one we call it as amoeboid movement. The amoeboid movement is explained by L.H. Hyman with the help of Solgel theory. The Solgel theory is supported by Pantin and Mast. This Solgel theory also explained by Goldacre and Larsch and also explained by Allen etc. persons. But here regarding this question, widely accepted theory for the pseudopodial formation. One we call it as contraction theory, and the second one we call it as rolling movement theory, and the third one we call it as Solgel theory, and the fourth one we call it as surface tension theory. What is widely accepted theory throughout the universe? That we call it as Solgel theory. Who proposed this theory? L.H. Hyman. Who supported the Solgel theory? That we call it as Pantin and Mast. Now move for the next question. Angelopodia. Now as we observe the second type of locomotory organelle and third type of locomotory organelle. The second type we call it as flagella and the third one we call it as cilia. The flagella and cilia arise from the basal granule. According to the opinion of L.H. Hyman, the flagella and cilia are called Angelopodia. Why they are called Angelopodia? They help in the progression of the body. The flagella and cilia help in the progression of the body. Now as we observe the Angelopodia, one we call it as cilia and flagella protozoans. The second one we call it as Pseudopodia. The third one we call it as myonemes. And the fourth one we call it as Pseudopodia and flagella. But according to the L.H. Hyman, what are the examples for the Angelopodia? One example is flagellum and the second example is cilia. Now here the correct answer is the first one. Now we go for the next question. A flagellum turns like a screw. Now as we observe one flagellated organism. This is one flagellated organism. The flagellated organism may be Euglena or Trypanosoma gambinis, whatever it may be. Now this is one flagellated organism. Now in its body flagellum is present. As we observe the movements of the flagellum exhibits undulations. The flagellum exhibits sidewise lashing movement. The flagellum exhibits the bending movement. In some cases, as we observe the flagellum rotates like a screw. That also called the flagellum rotates like a watch spring. Now as we observe the question, the flagellum turns like a screw. Where we have to observe this question? One we call it as simple gyration. What is meant by gyration? As we observe the flagellum rotates like a clockwise manner. As the flagellum rotates like a clockwise manner, the animal rotates in the anti-clockwise direction. That we call it as gyration. Such simple gyration. In the process of simple gyration, the flagellum rotates like a screw or the flagellum rotates like a watch spring. Now what is the correct answer for this question? The simple gyration. Now we go for the next question. Small zigzag movement in the protozoans caused by contraction and relaxation of myonemes is called. Now as we observe here, the question is zigzag. The zigzag movement is also called gliding movement. How the gliding movement is brought by? Now as we observe the body of Euglena, this is one example. In some ciliates, in some flagellates, as we observe the body is covered and protected by pellicle. In all ciliates, in all flagellates, the body is covered and protected by pellicle. Below pellicle, what is present? The ectoplasm. In the ectoplasm, obliquely arranged, what are present? The myonemes. Now as we observe the myonemes, The myonemes play an important role in the gliding movement. Now as we observe the gliding movement is brought by contraction and relaxation of myonemes. Because of the contraction and relaxation of myonemes, at the time of locomotion, the body exhibits slight zigzag motion or rotation or the movement. Now, small zigzag movement in the protozoans caused by contraction and relaxation of myonemes is called. One we call it as gliding, second one we call it as gyration, third one we call it as amoeboid movement, and the fourth one we call it as metaboli. Here what is the correct answer? The first answer, that is called the gliding movement. Now we go for the next question. Stichopneumatic flagellum is seen in. Now as we observe the types of flagella, this part we call it as pellicle. Below pellicle what is present? Ectoplasm. In the ectoplasm what is present? The basal granule. From the basal granule the axonium arises. The entire axonium is covered and protected by protoplasmic sheath. Now either right side or left side what are present? The lateral appendages. Such type of flagellum we call it as stichopneumatic flagellum. What is meant by stichopneumatic flagellum? Here entire axonium is covered and protected by flagellum. Either right side or left side what are present? One row of lateral appendages are present. Such stichopneumatic flagellum is going to observe in. One example we call it as euglena, and the second example we call it as astacia. Now stichopneumatic flagellum is seen in. One option is euglena, amoeba, polytoma, acinata. What is the best example? The euglena. Now we go for the next question. Locomotory organelles move collectively. Now as we observe the flagella and the cilia, generally the flagellum is one in number. So the flagellum moves solitarily or singly. As we observe the Pseudoporeal, no doubt they are appear and disappear purely temporary. Now here regarding the question, the locomotory organelles move collectively. Generally in all ciliates, minimum number of cilia we call it as 3000 cilia. As we observe the cilia, they are short and hair-like. They are generally more in number. As cilia are more in number, they move collectively. Now based on this information, locomotory organelles move collectively. One we call it as Pseudoporeal, no doubt it is eliminated because these are purely temporarily. And the third one, flagella, generally it is one in number, it moves solitarily, eliminate. And the fourth one we call it as setae because it is not discussed in the Protozoa, discussed in the Annelida. Now what is the last answer for this question is the cilia, they move collectively. Now we go for the next question. The simplest flagellum. What is meant by simplest flagellum? As we observe the types of flagella, one we call it as stichopneumatic, and the second one we call it as pantopneumatic, and the third one we call it as acroneumatic, and the fourth one we call it as pentachroneumatic, and the last one we call it as stichopneumatic, that means apneumatic. Now in the apneumatic, the body is covered by pellicle. Below pellicle what is present? The plasma lemma. Below plasma lemma what is present? Ectoplasm. In the ectoplasm what is present? Basal granule. Now from this basal granule the axonium arises. The entire axonium is covered and protected by the protoplasmic sheath. Now as we observe this type of flagellum, here no terminal filament because the entire axonium covered and protected by plasma lemma and no lateral appendages. Based on this information, what is the simplest flagellum? That we call it as apneumatic, where we have to observe the apneumatic, chylomonas and cryptomonas. Now due to the absence of terminal filament and lateral appendages, this one we call it as the simplest. Now what is the simplest flagellum? One stichopneumatic, and the second one we call it as monopodial, third one we call it as polypodial, and the fourth one we call it as apneumatic. The correct answer is apneumatic. Now move for the next question. Fountain zone theory is proposed by. Now according to the amoeboid movement, fountain zone theory was proposed by Allen. As we observe the fountain zone theory in the body of amoeba, this we call it as advanced end. In the advanced end, what is going to happen? Now this is actin protein and myosin protein. According to the fountain zone theory, in the body of amoeba, at anterior end or advanced anterior end, the actin molecule glides on myosin molecule, so that at advanced end a pressure or a pressure drag develops. With the help of this pressure drag from the posterior end, the plasma cell moves forward. Now fountain zone theory is proposed by one we call it as Lars, second one we call it as Ellen, and the third one we call it as Pendin, and the fourth one we call it as Mast. What is the correct answer? Ellen. Now we go for the next question. Metaboli is brought by, now one we call it as myonemes, and the second one we call it as pellicle, third one we call it as protein strips, and the last one we call it as pseudopodia. Now as we observe the movements of locomotion, one we call it as metaboli. As we observe the metaboli, in some protozoans the body is covered and protected by pellicle. Below pellicle what is present? The plasma lemma. Below plasma lemma what is present? Ectoplasm. As we observe this part of the body, what are present? The protein made structures are present. They are called proteinaceous strips. How they are arranged? Some are present dorsally, some are present dorsally, and some are present ventrally. Because of the protein strips, what is going to happen? Metaboli. During the metaboli, as we observe the body of organism, the body of organism slightly changes. Now metaboli is brought by, what is the correct answer? The protein strips. Now we go for the next question. The site of ATPase. Now as we observe the ultrastructure of flagellum or cilium, now this one we call it as one doublet. In the doublet, this one we call it as A microtubule, and this one we call it as B microtubule. In each doublet, as we observe the A microtubule, it has one pair of dynein arms. In the dynein arms, what is present? An enzyme present called ATPase. What is the function of ATPase? The ATPase brings hydrolysis of ATP. Because of the hydrolysis, the ATP dissociates into ADP, inorganic phosphate, and energy. Now based on this information, once again you have to identify the question. The site of ATPase is, one we call it as doublets, the second one we call it as the triplets, the third one we call it as dynein arms, and the fourth one we call it as radial spokes. Now what is the correct answer? The dynein arms. What is meant by dynein arm? These two arms are made by what type of protein? Dynein. Now we go for the next question. Energy for the contraction and relaxation of protein molecules are derived from. Now once again I am repeating the question. Energy for the contraction and relaxation of protein molecules are derived from. Where we studied this information, as we observe the amoeboid movement. The amoeboid movement explained by Goldacre and Lars based on molecular biology. According to the Goldacre and Lars, in the cytoplasm of amoeba, two types of proteins are present. One we call it as actin, and the second one we call it as myosin. Now during the formation and disappearance of Pseudopodia, the actin and protein molecules will undergo contraction and relaxation. For the contraction or for the folding of protein molecules, what is required? The energy is required. How they get the energy? From the hydrolysis of ATP. Now based on this information, the first one is ADP, second one is ATP, third one is MTOC, and the fourth one we call it as a nucleus. What is the correct answer? ATP. Now we go for the next question. Holotrichus are. Now as we observe the body of Paramecium. Now this is the body of Paramecium. The body of Paramecium is a slipper shape, hence it is called a slipper animalcule, we know very well. What is meant by holotrichi or holotrichus? In the body of Paramecium, all over the body what are present? The cilia are present. But in case of Verticella, this is the structure of Verticella. In the Verticella, this part we call it as peristome. In case of Verticella, the peristome having the cilia. But here the question is, what is meant by holotrichus? One we call it as Verticella, second one we call it as Paramecium, third one we call it as amoeba, fourth one we call it as polytoma. Now you have to eliminate one by one. In Verticella, the cilia present at peristome, that we call it as peritrichus. In amoeba, there is no cilia, Pseudopodia. In polytoma, what is present? Flagellum. Now what is the last answer for this question is Paramecium. In the body of Paramecium, all over the body, what are present? The cilia. Such condition we call it as holotrichus. Now we go for the next question. Peritrichus or peritrich. Now as we observe the Verticella, in the body of Verticella, this we call it as oral end or anterior end. At the oral end, what is present? Peristome present. Here around the peristome, what is present? Pellicle. Below pellicle, what is present? Plasma lemma. Below plasma lemma, what is present? Ectoplasm. In the ectoplasm, what are present? Basal granules. Now in the body of Verticella, at the anterior end, in the peristome, what are present? Cilia. Such type of cilia we call it as peritrichus. Now what is the answer? One is Verticella, second one Paramecium, third one amoeba, fourth one polytoma. Second, third, fourth options are eliminated. Now what is the leftover option? That we call it as Verticella. The correct answer is Verticella. Move for the next question. Pendular movements are brought by. Pendular movements are brought by. As we observe the differences between flagellum and cilium, as we observe the flagellum moves like a wave. The flagellum moves like a wave. That we call it as angular movements. As we observe the cilium, the cilium moves like a pendulum. Now the pendular movements are brought by. Now you have to identify the Pseudopodia. They help in the amoeboid movement. Flagella, it exhibits undulations or wave-like movement. Cilia, it exhibits or moves like a simple pendulum. Now you have to observe the question. Pendular movements are brought by. What is the correct answer? Cilia. Now these are some questions regarding the process of the locomotion. Now we have to discuss some bits regarding the reproduction of protozoa. Before going to the reproduction, we have to discuss some important points. As we observe the protozoa, whenever the conditions are favorable, all protozoans perform asexual reproduction. Whenever the conditions are unfavorable, the protozoans perform sexual reproduction. Now, what is the main difference between asexual and sexual reproduction? Generally, in the asexual reproduction, one cell or one organism participates. What about the sexual reproduction? In the sexual reproduction, two different organisms participate, or two different gametes participate, or two different pronuclei participate. As we observe the asexual reproduction, anywhere in the asexual reproduction, we should not explain the gametogenesis. We should not explain the fertilization. As gametogenesis absent, there is no reduction division. So in the asexual reproduction, always the mitotic division. In the asexual reproduction, as the reduction division totally absent, we should not explain the genetic variations and genetic recombinations. But while explaining the sexual reproduction, we have to explain the meiosis 1, that is the reduction division. Meiosis 2, that we call it as mitosis. So in the sexual reproduction, gametogenesis present, fertilization present, as reduction division is present, we have to explain the genetic variations and genetic recombinations. The asexual reproduction is brought by so many methods. What is the most important method? Binary fission. It may be longitudinal or transverse. The longitudinal binary fission can be explained with reference to Euglena and Verticella, and the transverse binary fission can be explained with reference to Paramecium. Now, as we observe the sexual reproduction, what is the important method that we call it as conjugation? The conjugation can be explained with reference to Paramecium as well as Verticella. Now we have to discuss some important bits regarding the reproduction. Now we move for the first question. Now you have to observe what is meant by the nuclear dimorphism. Now here the student gets some inconvenience. We already discussed in the phylum Protozoa that we call it as Opalinata. In the superclass Opalinata may be 2 nuclei or many nuclei present. But in the superclass Opalinata all nuclei are similar, homokaryotic. But here the question is nuclear dimorphism. As we observe the subphylum Coeliophora, in the subphylum Coeliophora only one class, that is Ciliata. In the class Ciliata, 2 different nuclei present. One we call it as macronucleus, second one we call it as micronucleus. The macronucleus is kidney shape, whereas the micronucleus is round shape. Now 2 different nuclei present, that we call it as nuclear dimorphism or heterokaryotic. Now you have to observe the answers. Opalinata, homokaryotic. Mastigophora, we should not explain. Ciliata, in the Ciliata 2 different nuclei, that we call it as nuclear dimorphism or heterokaryotic. The correct answer is 2. Now we move for the next question. The second one, the sporozoans and sarcodines perform reproduction by. Now first you observe the options, later we have to discuss the information. One we call it as binary fission, second one we call it as multiple fission, third one we call it as gemmation, and the fourth one we call it as plasmatomy. Now we are discussing some important points. Now what is the best example for the sporozoan? Plasmodium, that is the best example. What is the best example for the sarcodines? In the sarcodina 3 classes are present, what we learned to know very well. One we call it as Rhizopodia, second one Pyroplasmia, and the third one we call it as Actinopodia. Now in the sarcodines multiple fission is going to observe. In sporozoans, in the life history of Plasmodium, we discussed the multiple fission. Now the multiple fission is also called schizogeny. During the multiple fission, the parent cell converted into many daughter cells. Now in sporozoans and sarcodines, what type of reproduction? Asexual reproduction is brought by. What is the correct answer? The multiple fission. It is also called schizogeny. Now move for the next question. Trichocysts are present in the ectoplasm of. Now as we observe the ciliates, one example we call it as Paramecium. The Paramecium body is covered and protected by pellicle. P means pellicle. Now below pellicle what is present? Plasmalemma, PL. Below plasmalemma what is present? Ectoplasm. In the ectoplasm what are present? Trichocysts are present. In the ectoplasm trichocysts are present. Now here the student get a small doubt. The Paramecium is a unicellular organism. In the body of unicellular organism, trichocyst is a part. It is not a cell. It is the part of the cell. What is the function of trichocyst? It helps in the attachment as well as in the production as well as in the food collection. Now the trichocyst is compared to that of the nidoblast cell, where we discussed the nidoblast. It is also called stinging cell. We discussed it in the phylum Nidaria. So trichocyst and nidoblast. Nidoblast is a cell. Trichocyst is the part of cell. Trichocyst present in the ectoplasm of ciliates, whereas nidoblast present in all Nidarians. Now trichocysts are present in the ectoplasm of. The best option is Paramecium. Now we go for the next question. Gemmules are helping. Now as we observe the gemmules, take for example phylum Porifera. In all freshwater sponges, in shallow marine water sponges, whenever the conditions are unfavorable, the shallow marine water dries up, the freshwater dries up. then what is going to happen? They perform asexual reproduction by internal budding. What is meant by internal budding? The formation of buds inside the body. The internal buds are technically called gemmules. Now you have to observe. Gemmules help in digestion. It is not concerned. Now the third one, sexual reproduction. It is not concerned. Respiration. It is not concerned. Now the first option, third, fourth are eliminated. What is the leftover option? That we call it as asexual reproduction. Now we go for the next question. Match the following. No, now we have to observe what are present in the list 1 and list 2. Now as we observe the list 1, A, anisogamy, followed by budding, followed by isogamy, followed by plasmatomy, followed by multiplication. Now you carefully observe the list 2. One is amoeba, second one monocystis, third one opalina, and the fourth one acinata, and the last one plasmodium. Now so far we discussed some important points, based on that you have to guess. Now anisogamy. What is meant by anisogamy? The fusion of dissimilar gametes. What is the best example for the anisogamy? Here is plasmodium. What is meant by budding? The formation of buds. In the phylum Protozoa, where we have to observe the budding only in Suctorians. What are the example for the Suctorians? Acinata, Ephilota. Now here what is the example for budding? Acinata. What is meant by isogamy? The fusion of similar gametes. Isosimilar, anisodissimilar. Isogamy, the fusion of similar gametes. What is the best example? Monocystis. Now what is meant by plasmatomy? In the plasmatomy only cytoplasm divides but not the nucleus. Where we discussed the plasmatomy? In the phylum Protozoa, in the subphylum Sarcomastogophora, in the superclass Opalinata. So what is the best example for the plasmatomy? Opalina. Now the last one we call it as multiplication. Just we completed regarding the multiplication. The multiplication is seen in sporozoans and sarcodines. What is the best example for the sarcodines? Amoeba. Now we move for the next question. In which of the following protozoans? Again it is repeated. In which one of the following protozoans a multinucleate adult parent cell undergoes cytokinesis to form two multinucleate daughter cells? Now as we observe the superclass Opalinata, the best example we call it as Opalina. As we observe the body of Opalina, the body is made by, this is one cell. Now in the cytoplasm many nuclei are present. That condition we call it as multinucleate. Now in the body of Opalina or superclass Opalinata, the asexual reproduction is brought by plasmatomy. Now during plasmatomy only cytoplasm divides but not nuclei. Now the parent body converted into two daughter cells. As we observe the daughter cells, in the daughter cell the number of nuclei less than that of the nuclei present in the body of the parent. Now based on this information, what is the correct answer? Acinata, Paramecium, Opalina and Euglena. Now what is the correct answer? Opalina. Now move for the next question. Assertion or statement. The vigor and vitality in Verticella is lost due to repeated binary fissions. Now as we observe the sexual reproduction, whenever the conditions are unfavorable, the protozoans reproduce sexually. What are the unfavorable conditions? One is the food materials are absent, and the second one is because of the repeated binary fissions, the macronucleus lost its vigor and vitality. That means the macronucleus unable to perform its vegetative functions. Whenever the macronucleus unable to perform its vegetative functions, the animal undergoes conjugation or sexual reproduction. Now the vigor and vitality in Verticella lost due to repeated binary fission. 100% correct assertion or statement. Now what is the reason? Macronucleus divides automatically and cause chromosomal imbalance which impairs the vegetative functions. It means as long as asexual reproduction is going on, along with the micronucleus, the macronucleus also divides. As continuously macronucleus divides, there is imbalance of chromosomes in the macronucleus. So the macronucleus is unable to discharge its vegetative functions. Automatically the animal lost its vigor and vitality. Now you have to observe the correct answer for this question. Both are correct and R explains A. Now we go for the next question. The following are the statements about Verticella. Don't go for the statements. Below the statements you have to identify. From the above statement, select the correct statements. Now go for the question. The following are the statements about Verticella. Now the first statement, the microconjugate, it is also called the male conjugate. The microconjugate can undergo encystment during unfavorable conditions. It is 100% wrong, because we know very well in the Verticella conjugation, two types of conjugates are present. One we call it as the female conjugate or macroconjugate. One we call it as male conjugate or microconjugate. The microconjugate is small. The microconjugate has two sets of cilia. The microconjugate can move. Its lifespan is only 1 day or 24 hours. It never becomes the normal Verticella. It never undergoes encystment. Now, the microconjugate can undergo encystment. Wrong. It is eliminated. Now, the second one. The macroconjugate differs from the normal adult individual only physiologically. Now, as we observe, this is the normal Verticella, this is the macroconjugate. The normal Verticella and macroconjugate morphologically similar, but as we observe the macroconjugate or female conjugate, it is stationary, does not move. The macroconjugate undergoes conjugation, whereas the normal Verticella does not undergo conjugation. So, the normal Verticella and macroconjugate morphologically similar but physiologically dissimilar. So, based on this information, the second statement is correct. Now, the third one. Conjugates are formed asexually. How? As we observe the Paramecium and Verticella, as long as conditions are favorable, they undergo repeated asexual reproductions. With the onset of conjugation, the Verticella undergoes asexual reproduction and gives rise to two conjugates. One we call it as macro, one we call it as micro. Now, based on this information, what are the correct statements? Second and third.